Hi there, this is Neil Salvage, and welcome to this podcast, Gassing On. Yes, we're going to gas on about the world of ground gas. We're going to meet people in the industry. We're going to visit places and generally find out about interesting things that are happening, developing, and the changes that have gone on before us. So welcome on board and hope you enjoy this podcast. So today I'm joined by Simon Hunt from EHS Support. Good evening, good afternoon. How are you, Simon?
Very good, thanks, Nick. Well, it's my morning for you because I'm the other side of the world. So.
Oh, where exactly are you today?
Today I am sitting at my breakfast table in Auckland, New Zealand, and we're in the depths of autumn, but it hasn't rained for a long time.
Oh, well, thanks for joining us today, and I'm really pleased to put a bit of an international vibe on the podcast. Obviously, we're popping these out. I've got a few luminaries from the industry, and I'm glad that you could join us, Simon. So, what I was going to ask you first, Simon, how did your journey into ground gas come about? How did it start?
I think ground gas started probably 1985 or 86 in the UK. Obviously, I grew up in England and was educated there, did my first and second degrees there, and worked as a consultant from probably 86 through to 93, and I moved to New Zealand in 93. So I think my first experience of ground gas was probably in about 1986, working for a company in Kenilworth called Applied Geology, where we were starting to do brownfield development work and look at landfill gas. And I think from memory, we were working with Marion Carter at that time on projects. And so that kind of evolved from there. I did my master's at Imperial in about 87 and then worked up in Manchester, which was probably the first, proper experience of dealing with landfill gas or ground gas at that point, which was probably about 1987, I think, really. And then obviously at that point, LOSC and all that kind of thing happened, and everyone was busily, I think, in the UK at that time, doing landfill gas investigations, with limited guidance and interesting instruments.
Excellent, yeah. So how's that, and now, when did you end up in New Zealand? How did that all come about?
I moved here in 93, primarily to go rock climbing and mountaineering, and having left the UK in a recession, I think in about 93, I arrived here, and there was a vast amount of work, and then very quickly, I was doing a lot of work in New Zealand and then working up in Southeast Asia. So for the first 3-4 years, I worked as a consultant in New Zealand and up in Papua New Guinea and Fiji and Malaysia and stuff like that, all to do with contaminated land, with different sorts of landfill gas type issues and vapor intrusion issues. And then for my sins, I worked for a big ugly oil company for quite a long time, based here and working through Asia and Africa, basically. So.
Right. So, obviously, comparing the different countries, what's the variation like between UK and Australasia? Is there a lot of differences in the ground gas world?
There's certainly a lot of differences. I mean, if we look at it now, everybody either side of the Tasman here in Australia generally leverage from a landfill gas perspective the UK guidance, the UK standards. Certainly in Australia, they have written some of their own guidance, certainly New South Wales EPA, very much a sort of a take on what's happening in the UK. And over here, we tend to leverage exactly what's done in the UK, although, I mean, the way it's actually enforced in regulation is a little bit tricky because there's an absence of guidance here. So how people apply, UK-based guidance and standards to settings here, it kind of works, but then, at times the house construction is totally different. So you kind of need to tweak it to a certain extent.
Well, I think we're finding that here in the UK as well. The markets are constantly evolving and modern methods of construction are coming into play now. You do a lot of like prefabbed and concrete construction over in Australia and New Zealand. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have a lot of tilt slab construction, a vast amount of tilt slab construction, which is probably pretty ugly from an aesthetic perspective, but it's a very quick method of construction. Certainly with the earthquakes that we've had, driven in part because of the major Christchurch earthquakes, there's been a bit of a rethinking on foundations design, and there's a lot of riprap foundations, which I think obviously used in the UK as well, used here extensively. What we don't have in terms of mitigation, we don't have the access to the materials. It's not a commodity type product over here, putting in the mitigation, whereas, relative to the UK, where it's more of a specialist delivery here.
Right. And what's the state of play of construction and the contaminated land sector in New Zealand and Australia at the moment? Is it very busy? Is there construction in a good shape over there at the moment?
It's busy as hell here. I mean, there's an app, well, probably like the UK. There's a complete shortage on housing. So the government here, through the government entity that's basically providing state housing called Kaingahora, is actively building. Can't build enough houses. Probably a little bit like the UK. And obviously, historically, they've all been timber type. Well, they're all relatively timber frame buildings, but they're on concrete slabs. There's a lot of encroachment on existing land, so you're getting recycling of land in the urban areas, encroachment on legacy brownfield sites or redevelopment of brownfield sites, and then as they kind of push out into the more rural areas around the peripheries of the cities, there's been an awful lot of historically market gardens and infilling and things like that. So you can't build a house here now without touching some form of contaminated land, to a certain extent.
Well, I know New Zealand's certainly got some interesting geology, and a few colleagues have mentioned about different geological formations. Is radon much of an issue for you in New Zealand?
No, we haven't. We don't have a lot of granite, so we don't tend to get a lot of radon. Certainly, in parts of the country which are highly active from a geothermal perspective, then hydrogen sulfide is obviously a big issue in certain parts of the country. And increasingly, they're coming across, or it's starting to be a bit more prevalent, large deposits of peat, which aren't necessarily generating vast amounts of gas, but they're certainly generating aggressive ground kind of conditions as well. So, certainly in Australia, you've had a lot of issues to do with acid sulfate soils, and I think the engineers and regulators are just starting to pick up on these acid sulfate soils over here as well. So.
And you mentioned earlier about legacy sites. Is the VOCs and the nasty hydrocarbons, they're a big issue for you in redeveloping land over in New Zealand?
Yes and no. There's been a long history of obviously fuel use over here, and obviously working for an oil company previously, we lost a certain amount of fuel, as everybody does historically, to ground, and so a lot of those sites were dealt with quite a number of years ago. But obviously, as this land is getting recycled, then you're coming across sites where there are either legacy contamination issues or certainly vapor intrusion issues. Chlorinated solvents from a contaminated land perspective are pretty poorly regulated here. In fact, they're not regulated at all, to be quite honest. So we end up leveraging overseas guidance. But the use of chlorinated solvents in dry cleaning sites is still quite prevalent. So I think you touch any dry cleaning site, and you took urban Auckland. I think I did a survey some time ago. Probably 90% of the dry cleaners in the urban part of Auckland always still use chlorinated solvents. So you will find those problems. And certainly, obviously, we've dealt with a lot of chlorinated solvent problems over here, and probably elsewhere in the world, they tend to push the price up in terms of just the physical remediation and mitigation. So,
well, the interesting thing is, Simon, you have links with the Black Country and the West Midlands, where I'm located now. Brownfield development is a big government policy, because I know New Zealand, has always been a very green kind of government there, hasn't it? A very green-led policies and governance. Is that a big thing for the New Zealand market as well? Brownfield first and regeneration of those sites?
Well, not in the same way. I mean, we don't. It's a bit like the States, probably Australia to a certain extent. I mean, certainly the legacy of industrial development doesn't exist, in New Zealand, comparison to the UK. So a lot of sites we tend to get are just, sole source contaminated sites. They've just really had one industry perhaps on top of them, or perhaps two, unlike the UK, where things probably date back to the Roman times in certain parts of the country. So we don't have that big cocktail of contaminants, and plus we don't have big industry. But certainly where New Zealand's been out contaminating sites, it's done a pretty good job in places, certainly with chemical use and stuff like that. So you get very discrete pockets of industrial activity, and even though the country's only been out manufacturing and using chemicals since probably the mid 1800s, where it's had opportunity, it's done a pretty good job of contaminating soil and groundwater, and obviously the issues that go with it. But the government doesn't necessarily have a policy as such in terms of pushing brownfield development, so we don't see those sorts of tax breaks or things like that,
right?
To kind of stimulate that kind of activity. But the sort of intensity of redevelopment in the urban areas is actually just recycling, the land as a consequence of that. And I've just been doing work for Kainga Ora, which is the government sort of state house builder, writing policy for them over how to manage their portfolio of land relative to all the other work they do on the sites in terms of sustainability issues, recycling soil, and that sort of thing. So,
no, that's really interesting, Simon. It it certainly opens up to the listeners that we might have on board, to give them a perspective from somewhere else in the world, and really appreciate you contributing this. Simon, if anybody wants to get hold of you, how can they get in contact with you?
It's quite simple. Email address is just simon.hunt@ehs-support.com, or find me on LinkedIn or somewhere like that. So, yep.
And your company's got a website out there as well. People can dip in and see.
Yeah, we're a small operation here. We're connected to a company in Australia and the States. I think from memory, there's about 160 sort of environmental contaminated land risk assessment specialists, remediation specialists sitting in the States, and probably I think at the moment headcount of about 40 odd folks in Australia and a small number of people in South Africa. So, well,
Simon, that's really great of you to share those facts and figures and information, and really appreciate it. And send our best wishes to all your colleagues over in New Zealand for us. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Neil.
Brilliant. So thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye now.